He didn't wait for the gavel. He didn't wait for the chairwoman. He didn't wait for the rules. Donald J. Trump stood before the hearing had officially begun, rising not as a witness, not as a guest, but as the architect of a scandal that had yet to be spoken aloud. In a room designed for protocol and pacing, he cut straight through it like a man crashing his own arraignment. No documents in hand, no legal team in tow. Just Trump, standing tall with the kind of defiance that turns silence into spectacle. And then, with cameras humming and every pair of eyes locked on him, he delivered the opening statement that no one asked for, but everyone would remember. You dragged me here to answer for money. But what you really hate is that I used it better than you ever could. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a provocation. Not defensive, not apologetic. It was Trump doing what Trump does, flipping the table before anyone else could sit down. The gavel finally dropped, half a beat too late. Chairwoman barely got a word in before Rep. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward deliberate, unshaken, heels sharp against marble, voice even sharper. She didn't blink. She didn't rush, because she didn't need to. Trump had started the fire. She brought the oxygen, and he was about to suffocate on his own bravado. Trump turned again, voice booming. I raised more in one night than most of you raise in a lifetime because I don't sell guilt. I sell vision. Crockett approached the microphone, stopped dead center, locked eyes with him like steel meeting stone. You don't sell vision, Mr. Trump, she replied. You rent access, and the invoice just came due. A few murmurs in the back. Gensler, silent beside her, placed a small black USB on the witness table. Nothing on it but the SEC seal. No folders, no words, just raw implication. We're not here for your theatrics, Crockett said, leaning into the mic without raising her voice. We're here for the transfer logs. We're here for the offshore wallets. We're here to find out when a gala became a gateway and who held the keys. She tilted her head slightly, not as a challenge, but as a warning. You think this is a show? That's fine. But the receipts don't applaud. On the screen behind her, a slide flickered into place. Stark white letters on a black field. Request for full congressional investigation. Trump Gala cryptocurrency event. The silence was immediate. No coughs, no chairs shifting. Even the reporters stopped typing. Trump, arms folded, smirked like a man who'd practiced it in the mirror. Keep projecting, he said. I built towers. You build committees. But Crockett wasn't smiling. She stepped once closer. You built towers with mirrored windows, Mr. Trump, but today you're the one being reflected. And unlike your coins, our oversight doesn't vanish in the blockchain. Her voice never broke pace. You think this is about fear. It's not. It's about function. It's about what happens when the presidency gets tokenized and auctioned behind velvet ropes. Trump opened his mouth and paused. Just for a second. A moment too long. Enough for her to finish. You call this a witch hunt. I call it an audit. And with that, the balance shifted. He had opened with fire. But now the light belonged to her, and the shadows were about to be mapped. Trump didn't blink. Not when the first spreadsheet lit up. Not when the number 306,448,201 blinked on the screen like a neon confession. Not even when Gary Gensler, the SEC chair who speaks with the rhythm of a closing argument and the patience of someone used to watching billionaires dodge subpoenas, calmly stated the origin: 38 anonymous crypto wallets, one night, one gala, one unprecedented transfer of untraceable influence. And yet, Trump sat like he was watching someone else's indictment. His hand rested on the back of his chair with all the ease of a man reclining in a boardroom he still thinks he owns. "Every campaign takes donations," he said, letting the syllables land with that signature mix of sneer and sermon. "I just chose a smarter currency. That's what leaders do." It was less of a defense and more of a business pitch, complete with the smug confidence of a man trying to sell Bitcoin to a bankruptcy court. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't match his tone. She didn't need to. Instead, she clicked to the next slide. 12 foreign-based wallets, each feeding separate political action committees. Those PACs, in turn, sending cash to 3 policy research centers that, as luck or loyalty would have it, produced white papers echoing Trump's public stances almost word for word within a week of the gala. She let the graphic speak for itself. Then came her voice cool, stripped of outrage, and far more dangerous because of it. You didn't raise funds. You sold proximity. A seat next to you became a vote inside the Oval. No fire, no drama, just arithmetic, politics, and a cold eye on what happens when access becomes inventory. Trump cracked a grin like he'd just been complimented. "So what?" Lincoln gave whiskey. JFK gave charm. "I gave tokens," he said, hands open as if presenting a product line. "We all trade something." The committee room didn't react. Perhaps because even by his standards, the comparison was so grotesquely self-inflated it stunned the air silent. Crockett didn't take the bait. She simply stepped closer to the monitor, her finger landing on the nexus point where all the lines converged. "You didn't just trade," she said, sharp and slow. "You cleared access like inventory." It wasn't a metaphor, it was logistics, as if the presidency had been sliced into SKUs and priced for market efficiency. Gensler, seated but poised, added the kind of detail no press secretary wants to hear. "Several of these wallets are under active federal investigation. Some trace back to blacklisted jurisdictions." It was the financial equivalent of describing a fire and then casually pointing out that gasoline cans were stacked beside the matchbox. Trump shrugged, the gesture dripping with that peculiar mix of arrogance and ignorance that had defined every scandal he never admitted. "You fear innovation because it doesn't ask for permission," he said. "That's your problem, not mine." And there it was, the billionaire libertarian gospel, condensed into a sentence that could double as a crypto scam slogan. Innovation, to Trump, wasn't about expanding opportunity. It was about skipping oversight. It was about sidestepping the annoying part of leadership responsibility and monetizing the illusion of vision. The irony, of course, is that the man who campaigned on draining the swamp seemed to have built a private crypto canal through it, toll booth included. There's a kind of audacity in defending the sale of political intimacy as smart fundraising. It's like calling a casino a retirement plan. What Trump sold at that gala wasn't just a dinner seat. It was the promise of influence without visibility, policy without fingerprints. And when questioned, his only defense was that others did it too, only less efficiently. Lincoln had whiskey, Kennedy had charisma, Trump had crypto. And in that comparison, he didn't see shame. He saw legacy. But Crockett wasn't here to debate economic philosophy or romanticize corruption with historical cosplay. She saw the gala for what it was, not a celebration of innovation, but a controlled burn of institutional trust. As the screen behind her shifted to the third layer of connections, the map of coin to policy to committee action, the tone of the room shifted too. It was no longer about whether something was illegal. It was about whether democracy could survive being brokered like real estate. And while Trump leaned back in his chair, trying to wear bravado like armor, there was a crack forming not in his voice, but in the room around him. This wasn't a courtroom, and no one had declared guilt. But already, the jury of public opinion had taken its seat, and the next slide, cold and clinical, would only press harder into the question no donation receipt could answer. How much influence does a coin really buy when the entire presidency is on the menu? The screen changed again, and this time it didn't flicker. It settled with eerie calm on an invitation white linen font, gold trim, and a line of text so understated it practically whispered corruption. Tier 3 includes private policy roundtable with advisory team. In any other context, it might have sounded like a luxury retreat, the kind Fortune 500 CEOs pay for with frequent flyer miles and a wink. But here, under oath, under lights, under scrutiny, it landed like a dropped dossier. Jasmine Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Who selected the 220 guests?" she asked, voice low, direct, as if she already knew the answer. "Who verified the wallets? Where's the firewall between power and crypto?" Her eyes scanned the room, not for drama, but for accountability. And that made the silence that followed even louder. Trump, never one to let an accusation stand when mockery could be louder, laughed like he was still on the campaign trail. He pointed a finger toward the dais, not accusing, just casually dismissive, like someone swatting at a fly with a Rolex. "You don't want firewalls," he grinned. "You want leashes. You can't leash tech, Jasmine. That's why it outran you." It was the kind of line that sounds clever until you remember what's at stake. As if the entire federal government was just another app Trump thought he could swipe right on. And then came the entrance. Vivek Ramaswamy, part venture capitalist, part culture warrior, all brand slipped into the witness chair with the posture of a man who thought he was auditioning for a new cabinet position that hadn't been invented yet. He nodded as if his agreement came preloaded. "Blockchain is trust without bureaucracy," he declared, polished and perfectly quotable. "That's progress. What you call loopholes, we call tools." Tools, in this case, apparently included anonymous wallets, jurisdiction-hopping shell companies, and advisory dinners that came with federal policy attached like a party favor. If that's trust, then Watergate was just an overzealous paperwork audit. Gensler didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words landed with the weight of a closing bell. "Tools don't buy legislation," he said. "These transactions correspond with tax exemptions, trade adjustments, and public contract decisions." The slide behind him glowed with date-stamped connections. Crypto deposits on Monday, policy shifts on Wednesday. It wasn't a theory, it was a sequence. Trump leaned back, stretching the chair to its limit, and exhaled like a man who'd just beaten a parking ticket, not danced around campaign finance law. "When Wall Street does it, you clap," he said, with all the smugness of a man who truly believes oversight is a conspiracy. "When I do it, you indict." The line, delivered with his signature disdain for nuance, ignored the key difference. Wall Street didn't sell access to the executive branch over cocktails and QR codes, and even if it did, it never printed policy roundtable on the menu. Crockett stepped forward again, not with fury but with precision, the scalpel to Trump's sledgehammer. "Wall Street plays the market," she said. "You became the market." It wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis. When the man becomes the marketplace, when access to him becomes currency, what follows isn't innovation. It's a clearance sale on sovereignty. She didn't shout. She didn't over-explain, because she didn't have to. The room already understood. This wasn't politics. It was product distribution with the presidency as premium inventory and proximity as the only form of payment accepted. And as Trump reclined with that practiced smirk, as Vivek adjusted his cufflinks like a man unbothered by federal inquiry, and as the data behind them burned brighter than any rebuttal, the audience watching from kitchens and cab rides and break rooms across the country began to see it too. Not just the arrogance, but the infrastructure. The gala wasn't a fundraiser, it was a showroom, and the next screen looming just one slide away was about to reveal what had been sold and who had bought it. The next slide dropped like a guillotine clean, precise and color-coded for discomfort. A glowing map of anonymous crypto wallets lit the screen behind Gensler, the kind of visual you might find in a cybercrime documentary. Except this one was real, live, and aimed straight at the man who once called himself the most transparent president in history. Red for high risk, orange for unverified, gray for ghosts. These wallets, Gensler began, weren't just anonymous, they were radioactive. 19 of them flagged in red, each tied to a foreign entity under current U.S. sanctions. The destinations? Macau, the Cayman Islands, Dubai. If Mar-a-Lago had a foreign donor punch card, it would have been full. Jasmine Crockett didn't need drama, she had data. And with it, she leveled a question that sliced through Trump's smirk like glass across velvet. "Did you know who paid to sit next to you?" she asked coldly, "or did you simply not care?" There was no grandstanding, no raised voice, just the deadly calm of a prosecutor who's already seen the receipts. Trump didn't flinch. His voice came low, dismissive, as if he were being asked about expired coupons. "When you run a movement, people show up," he said, eyes scanning the committee like they were interns at one of his failed casinos. "I don't ID donors, that's your bureaucracy talking." It was the kind of line that sounds brave to people who've never read a subpoena. A convenient alibi masquerading as populism. He made it sound like the presidency was a tailgate party and the Secret Service just forgot the guest list. But Gensler wasn't buying the folksy insurrection. "This isn't oversight," he said, voice as flat as a ledger. "It's intentional blindness." The blind trust was never blind, just silent. And there it was, the quiet indictment, not of illegality, but of architecture. A structure built to conceal, not to clarify. A trust that closed its eyes only when it helped open doors. Trump leaned forward, seizing the moment, jabbing back not with facts but with fireworks. "I didn't break trust," he said. "I broke your monopoly. Blockchain gave power back to the people. You hate that it didn't ask you first. It was the kind of red meat line that plays well on Truth Social and badly under oath. Because the irony of calling yourself a revolutionary while sitting on millions funneled through shell wallets is that you're not fighting the system, you're franchising it." Vivek Ramaswamy, always eager to turn a regulatory scandal into a TED Talk, joined the skirmish with a tone of intellectual superiority and tech bro arrogance. Crypto crosses borders? Yes, he said smoothly. But so does ambition. What you fear isn't laundering, it's losing control of the narrative. That, of course, is the most efficient kind of gaslighting, turning financial exposure into a First Amendment issue. As if the real crime here wasn't policy for sale, but the audacity of being questioned about it. But Crockett wasn't buying it. She took a breath, then drove the point like a nail through marble. We fear a republic sold in tokens, she said, where policies are written in offshore meetings and sealed with meme coins. It wasn't just a line, it was a thesis, a summary of everything that had unraveled since the first blockchain buzzword collided with campaign finance reality. What Trump had presented as innovation, Crockett redefined as erosion, not of tradition, but of trust. Because when governing becomes gamified, when citizenship gets reduced to wallet addresses and gala tiers, what's left isn't freedom. It's a coupon code for democracy's liquidation sale. And as that map behind them continued to pulse one red dot at a time, so did the weight of the next question. If foreign wallets were buying their way into America's most exclusive political dinner, what exactly was being served at the table? The screen didn't just change, it advanced. What Gensler unveiled next wasn't another theory or abstract accusation. It was a timeline. Clean, clinical, inescapable. On one side, a list of major crypto transactions logged during the Trump Gala. On the other, corresponding policy shifts issued within 24 to 72 hours. The implication wasn't subtle, it was surgical. A $8.2 million transfer routed through anonymized wallets. Less than 2 days later, a tweet from Trump's official account called for scaling back SEC oversight of a promising new digital marketplace. It wasn't a coincidence. It was choreography. And Gensler didn't need to say it outright. The math was doing all the speaking. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, her index finger aimed not at Trump, but at the digital cause and effect blinking behind him. "This isn't fundraising," she said, slow and deliberate. "This is functional bribery." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The term hit like a cold slap. Functional, not theoretical, not metaphorical, not inferred. This was bribery that worked. Bribery that produced deliverables. Bribery that came with a return policy disguised as a tweet. Trump fired back instantly, tone rising just enough to crack the varnish of composure. "No one buys policy from me," he snapped. "They invest in leadership. The fact that you call support suspicion shows how far you've fallen." It was classic Trump. Deny the structure, ridicule the question, reframe corruption as confidence. But there was something different now. His cadence tightened, his jaw locked, and the deflection no longer landed as cleanly as it once had. Because this wasn't 2016. This wasn't a rally. This was receipts. Gensler clicked again. A new diagram filled the Wall 27 wallets, each routing funds through 3 offshore exchanges, converging on a single pack responsible for crafting a tax platform so laser-tailored to blockchain operators it read like an invoice with policy attached. This wasn't politics as usual. This was engineering. A transaction loop disguised as ideological alignment. Vivek Ramaswamy, always eager to toss a libertarian blanket over a regulatory wildfire, jumped in without missing a beat. "You're criminalizing success," he declared, voice polished like a TED Talk no one asked for. Every venture needs fuel. These coins are modern campaign energy. It was the kind of line that might earn a slow nod from Silicon Valley, but lands differently when followed by SEC flowcharts and foreign shell entities. Campaign energy doesn't usually involve Cayman Islands routing codes. Crockett pivoted, eyes fixed on him now. "Campaigns take donations to speak louder," she said. "You took payments to rewrite the script." The room tightened around her words, because this wasn't about ambition anymore. It was about authorship, about who really penned the policies that shaped a federal platform. And when that authorship originates from decentralized wallets with invisible fingerprints, the fiction becomes harder to ignore. Trump tried to recover, but something cracked in the delivery. His voice pitched up, his rhythm off. "Every president rewards supporters," he insisted. "Lincoln gave jobs. FDR built agencies. I build with capital that moves." But the comparison wasn't holding. Lincoln didn't sell cabinet meetings over port wine. Roosevelt didn't sign New Deal chapters based on crypto transfers from Dubai. And capital that moves without names or accountability isn't leadership, it's laundering with better lighting. The problem with Trump's defense wasn't just its hollowness, it was how familiar it had become. The same recycled narrative. Disruption framed as destiny, opacity as innovation, and consequence as jealousy. But now the data outpaced the spin. Every diagram Gensler showed was a mirror. Every line on those slides traced back to the same brutal question. If policy changes track payments this precisely, then where exactly does democracy begin and transaction end? And the next slide, still dimmed behind Gensler's shoulder, held the answer to a more chilling question. Who exactly was in the room when those payments rewrote the country's laws? No music played when the next slide came up, but the silence had a soundtrack of its own. A web of 220 names, or rather, aliases, partner, friend, confidant, all color-coded and tangled into a map so vague it could have been drawn with a shrug. Gensler didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The point was too absurd to embellish. Not a single attendee at Trump's $300 million gala had been independently verified. No agency had cleared the guest list. No ethics officer had reviewed it. It was a who's who of who knows, and every one of them had been granted access as casually as someone RSVPing to a barbecue. "Your blind trust," Gensler said with the poise of someone who'd rehearsed this line just once, was a backstage pass. No audits, no watchdogs, just access labeled friendship. Trump didn't deny it. In fact, he leaned into it. His chin jutted forward, eyes locked straight ahead, voice smug with the confidence of a man who thought candor could disinfect corruption. "Washington runs on relationships," he said. "At least I don't pretend otherwise." It was the kind of defense that wasn't a defense at all. It was an open confession wrapped in a dare. As if admitting you ran a government like a private club somehow made you more authentic than the crooks who whispered behind closed doors. Crockett didn't blink. Her answer landed with surgical intent. "You didn't end hypocrisy," she said, sharp and steady. "You monetized it." The sentence didn't echo. It drilled into the wood-paneled walls and hung there, motionless and radioactive. Because that's what the data showed. And right on cue, the next chart lit the screen. Not just names and wallets, but timestamps and federal signatures. Internal policy edits sent to agencies within 48 hours of the gala. Typed, formatted, and traceable to people whose only credential was being rich enough to buy a seat at the table. Gensler's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, more lethal. "Every document reviewed," he said. "Every pattern mapped. Policy traded like commodity because access was productized." There it was, the real scandal, devoid of slogans or spectacle. Not a crime of chaos, but a blueprint of efficiency. This wasn't corruption by accident. It was corruption by design. Trump's posture shifted. The defiance was still there, but it had calcified. His hands gripped the table, knuckles whitening. His face locked into something between calculation and containment. For once, he didn't interrupt. He didn't reach for applause lines or recycled insults. He just stared toward the exit, as if weighing how many steps it would take to walk away without looking like he'd fled. The room noticed. The committee noticed. And Jasmine Crockett noticed. She moved closer, not physically but rhetorically, closing the distance with a line meant to wound, not impress. "You called it freedom," she said, "but even freedom has receipts. Show us one." It wasn't a question. It was a dare of her own. A challenge dressed in civility but sharpened with contempt. The kind of line that cuts deeper because it never raises its voice. And as the slide behind her held still names, edits, crypto IDs, dotted lines of implication masquerading as policy, the tension didn't break. It calcified. Because in that moment, everyone in the room knew that Trump's silence wasn't strategy. It was scarcity. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. And yet, the next question hadn't even arrived. The next file hadn't even opened. And the next collapse hadn't even started. Not yet. The slide lit up without warning. 23 federal civil judgments, one after the next, cold as tombstones, each bearing Trump's administration as the named defendant. A brutal roll call of legal defeat. 96% ended the same way, against him. No fine print, no ambiguity. And Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't have to. Her voice, quiet and methodical, delivered what headlines couldn't. "This isn't political loss," she said. "It's legal rejection. Even judges you chose saw through the spin." The room didn't stir, because the weight of that statement wasn't in the volume, it was in the math. And for a man who bragged about winning, 96% failure wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. Trump shot back reflexively. "Judges wear blue under their robes," he snapped, tone tightening like a hinge about to break. "Everyone in this town plays for one team." It was vintage grievance politics when facts corner you, blame the referee. But this time, even the old hits didn't land. The accusation, tired and fraying at the edges, sounded more like an excuse than a strategy. Because unlike rallies, the courtroom keeps receipts. Gensler advanced the next slide. 2 rulings appeared, both signed by judges handpicked by Trump himself, and beneath the official stamp, one phrase glared back: "Gross violation of campaign finance boundaries." There was no room for misinterpretation. The rulings didn't just go against him. They named the game he played and called it foul. Crockett stepped in again, not to rub it in, but to underline what was already bleeding. "Every courtroom you entered said the same thing," she said. "The rules you rewrote didn't survive daylight. It wasn't performance. It was confirmation. The hearing wasn't building a case. It was stacking bodies of evidence that had already been buried in court." That's when Vivek Ramaswamy lunged into the gap, trying to reboot the defense with libertarian flair. Entrepreneurs don't wait for approval, he argued, with the tone of a man who mistook prosecution for paperwork. They move. You want to jail innovation. It was the same tired gospel. That disruption justifies everything. That regulation is oppression in drag. That ambition excuses the blueprint for shadow finance. But Gensler didn't flinch. His answer cut through the smoke like frost through glass. Innovation doesn't fear sunlight, he said. Only laundering does. There it was. No poetry, no dramatics, just the dead weight of principle spoken without apology. It didn't matter how slick the branding, how many tech bros high-fived in the comment scripto that fear's exposure isn't currency. It's camouflage. Trump's eyes darted then, scanning the room not for applause, but for rescue. He wasn't looking at Crockett or Gensler anymore. He was searching the faces behind him, the ones in his own party, in his own trench. But something had shifted. The same lawmakers who once echoed his lines now sat still. Their gazes dropped. Their bodies stiffened, not in solidarity, but in self-preservation. And the silence said it all. No one was laughing anymore. The air wasn't partisan. It was clinical. Because in this room, with these facts and that scoreboard, Trump wasn't a persecuted outsider. He was just the losing defendant on the wrong end of a very long file. And the next file, already queued in Gensler's laptop, didn't promise a better day. It promised a closer look at something far worse than political fallout avoidance, that the loss wasn't accidental. It was engineered, bought, and packaged for resale. Then came the slide that cracked the floor beneath them. Not just numbers, anymore sequences. A clean clinical graph mapping meme coin donations from Trump's gala to 3 PACs. Then forward into 3 separate pieces of legislation, each one enacted within 72 hours of the money hitting the books. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't metaphor. It was the bloodstream of influence, digitized and time-stamped like a transaction log from the black market of democracy. Gensler didn't grandstand. He simply said, "We traced not just money, but motive. You didn't just accept funding. You sold function." It wasn't anger in his tone. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes from watching the law become a speed bump. Trump exploded. He stood so fast the chair barked backward. Both hands slammed the table with the kind of theatrical rage that once dominated debate stages, but now sounded like a man pounding the door of a courtroom he no longer controlled. "No law prohibits ambition," he snapped, voice cutting like metal. "I delivered results while you held hearings." It was his doctrine in one breath. That speed absolves method, and power excuses everything. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she clicked once. A new slide took over the screen, this one quieter, somehow colder. A simple diagram showing funds from the gala routed to a policy memo titled Veterans Policy, Draft Revision. A direct pipeline from anonymous coin to federal language. No names, no signatures, just a memo, rewritten by the money that hosted dinner. Across the room, a GOP lawmaker stood up. No statement, no protest, just silence and motion. The camera caught it. So did every journalist in the room. It wasn't defiance, it was distance, and it changed the atmosphere like a cold front. What had been tense now felt brittle. Even Trump seemed to notice. He didn't yell again. He spoke lower this time, quieter, but heavier. "I didn't sell access," he said. "I sold hope. That scares you. It was almost mournful, almost righteous, like a man who still believed he was misunderstood, not unmasked. Vivek didn't interrupt. For once, his voice didn't fill the silence. He sat frozen, eyes on the laptop screen in front of him. Whatever script he'd come prepared with no longer applied to the room he was sitting in, and the silence stretched not as a pause, but as an indictment. Gensler leaned in slightly, just enough to be heard. His tone was calm, but laced with the kind of contempt that doesn't raise its voice. Hope doesn't need shell companies. That was it. No punchline, no flourish, just a truth so blunt it didn't need amplification. Hope doesn't travel through unregistered wallets. Hope doesn't require Cayman routing. Hope, if real, doesn't need a blind trust. And in that moment, the gravitational center of the room shifted, not because Trump had been silenced, but because his force no longer pulled others in. He stood at the table, the same man who once made the air hum with volatility. But now, he looked like someone standing on a stage where the spotlight had dimmed, not because the show was over, but because the audience had started walking out. And behind Gensler, one more unopened file waited in silence, its contents not just explosive, but possibly irreversible. She didn't need a screen this time. No graphics, no data overlays, no cinematic slides blinking behind her. Jasmine Crockett stood still and spoke straight into the silence Trump had carved around himself. Her voice, low and unshaking, slipped past performance and landed somewhere far more dangerous. Clarity. "What remains of democracy?" she asked, "when a seat costs $5 million and buys a paragraph of policy?" No outrage, no theater, just a question so plain it felt radioactive. It didn't accuse, it just stood there, like a body found in daylight. Trump didn't answer. He didn't raise a hand, didn't lunge for the mic. He stood upright, posture still proud, eyes still sharp. But there was no weight behind it anymore. He had run out of pageantry. This wasn't a rally. There was no crowd left to clap. The man who once thrived on spectacle was now outlasted by stillness. The performance had ended, but the room hadn't applauded. It had simply moved on. Gensler quietly opened the final document, the last in a series that had replaced speculation with structure. On the screen appeared a new matrix. Names of gala attendees, well, the ones who used real names linked to crypto wallets, each thread connecting directly to policy impact scores. A metric that traced not what was said, but what was changed. Funding that didn't just support a cause, but sculpted legislation. This wasn't ideology. It was transaction. Politics rendered in code, in columns, in currency. A marketplace where ideals had barcodes and committee memos came with conversion rates. And as the screen grew more detailed, the room grew quieter. Each name that lit up drained a little more air from the chamber. No one interrupted. Not Vivek, not Trump, not even the loyalists on the far side of the aisle. Because the more complete the picture became, the more obvious the problem was. It didn't need interpretation. It spoke fluently in its own architecture. The graft wasn't hidden. It had simply been repackaged as modern efficiency. Crockett stepped forward once more, and her words carried a final precision that didn't aim to wound, but to finalize. "You called it trust," she said, "but the only thing your system protected was silence. No gaslighting, no deflection, just the quiet condemnation of a framework designed to conceal, and the bitter truth that it succeeded, not in protecting democracy, but in disguising its erosion as innovation. Vivek lifted his gaze for the first time in minutes. His lips parted slightly, reflexive, as if a tagline might still crawl its way to the surface. But nothing came. The instinct to defend had met its expiration. The air had changed, and even his slogans knew they wouldn't land. He closed his mouth again. That, too, was a verdict. And then Gensler closed it all, not with outrage, but with precision. Blind trust with no audit is not trust, he said. It's theater. The line wasn't meant to sting. It was a technical correction, spoken by a man who had catalogued every wallet, every timestamp, every donor-to-policy echo like an archivist of corruption. And in the final stillness that followed, the phrase hung not like a punch, but like a post-mortem. Trump was still standing, still gripping the table. His shoulders didn't slump, his jaw didn't tremble, but the room no longer orbited around him. The gravity was gone. The dominance that once bent cameras and questions in his direction now floated like a balloon whose string had finally slipped through his fingers, and the eyes that once followed him instinctively now looked elsewhere, at the data, at the question, at the cost. Because power without accountability doesn't disappear. It just becomes expensive. And somewhere behind the silence, a final slide waited, an image not of Trump, but of the structure he'd built, finally stripped of spin, standing exposed in its purest form, profitable, efficient, and utterly hollow. No one said it was over. No gavel came down, no closing remarks were read into the record. But the hearing had ended, unmistakably, completely. Crockett lowered the mic with the precision of someone who knew punctuation didn't require sound. Gensler shut his laptop without ceremony, like a surgeon zipping a finished body bag. Chairs creaked, papers shifted, but no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was absolute. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of consequence. Trump turned without a word. No entourage, no photographers, no staffer to brush lint from his lapel. Just a single figure walking toward the exit as if still pretending it wasn't one. No one followed. Not one Republican stood. Not one camera flash went off. Power doesn't always leave with a bang. Sometimes it just walks out, and the room decides not to walk with it. And that's when you know. Behind him, the main screen remained frozen, still displaying the final damning epitaph of the gala. Guest list, no signatures, no review, no compliance. It read less like a procedural failure and more like the marketing slogan of a corrupt empire that mistook access for merit. For once, the flashiest part of the entire operation was its absence of accountability. Outside the walls of the hearing, the digital dam burst. Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, all aflame. Hashtags trended faster than the transcript could be uploaded. Hashtag bot presidency, hashtag crypto gala, the silent verdict. Cable news didn't know how to spin it, but tried anyway. Fox News fractured in real time. One camp screamed witch hunt. The other asked, for the first time in a long time, is this the moment it starts to turn? Political action committees scrambled. By midnight, Trump's name had been scrubbed from crypto-aligned donation pages. URLs vanished. Invitations to future fundraisers were postponed indefinitely. Strategists made calls they hadn't rehearsed, asking donors not for loyalty, but for time. The machine didn't collapse. It simply stopped printing Trump's name on the label. And yet, there was no arrest, no courtroom verdict, no moment of handcuffs or perp walks. He left untouched by law but utterly eclipsed by exposure. What happened wasn't legal, it was gravitational. A man who once pulled every lens and headline toward himself now moved like a black hole that had finally gone cold. And the country saw it. From kitchen TVs to late-night podcasts, America didn't need a judge. It needed silence. And it got it. One political correspondent summed it up before the sun rose. He was never judged in court. But tonight, America watched power fall quiet. No theatrics, no speech, just a man walking out of a room that used to kneel for him. And nothing followed but air. As the hearing room emptied, Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her final words didn't need amplification. She didn't speak into the microphone. She didn't speak to Trump. She spoke to the record, and it heard her. Leadership chooses sunlight, not shadows, and certainly not the auction block. That was it. No rebuttal, no spin, just the last sentence in a story that had been written not in law, but in data, in silence, and in the slow, visible unraveling of a man who once sold strength until he had none left to spend.